We have been talking about the 10 Commandments, and in particular we've been looking at the 5th commandment, children being honoring your father and mother, and we've looked at a variety of different aspects of this, but last week we started looking at one of the aspects of this that is probably the most critical in terms of applying the principle of honoring your father and mother for us as Christians, which is this idea that as Christians we are expected to honor authority. That parents are the first kind of source of authority that we tend to encounter as children, but gradually, as we grow older, there are various other forms of authority that we begin to encounter and have to deal with, and that the scriptures teach us that we are supposed to treat those with respect, and we're supposed to honor those, even in some cases when they aren't particularly honorable or the kinds of authority that we'd like to have. So let's take a look here, because we were looking in Colossians. We looked at this passage last week, so just very briefly, we see this reiteration here of children being obedient to your parents and fathers not exasperating their children. Elsewhere we saw it said fathers do not, what was the expression that he uses, the other place we looked at? What are the fathers not supposed to do to their children?
Provoke.
Provoke, okay? So, and I think even though these are two different passages, the parallelism of them makes it pretty clear that they're a similar kind of idea. It would be fathers or parents misusing their authority in some way so that it creates a frustration, an unhappiness that's unnecessary. And there's a big difference, obviously, between a necessary unhappiness and an unnecessary unhappiness. In many cases, the operation of authority makes us unhappy, even if it's doing things that are legitimate and for the overall good of either ourselves or society. Whether it's a parent telling a child they can't have the cookie that they want, they've got to eat their dinner, or whether it is the law enforcement authority telling you that you can't go over the speed limit and giving you a fine if you do. There's reasons for those things, and they don't make us happy, but they are nevertheless a reasonable use of authority, because as long as they're applied consistently, there's no there's a good basis for it, and the consistent application means that it's being done fairly. Where you start to get people getting frustrated is whether you have when you have a parent who's capricious in terms of the rules that they have, or who doesn't tell you what the rules are and simply gets upset at sort of random and unpredictable times, or who is, for example, a parent who has a substance abuse problem, where their emotional state, their behavior is going to be very variable based on what they've been taking and when they've taken it. And so those kinds of situations can create some real exasperation, and it can provoke children. And by the same token, in our society, we see that even though in general most people are willing to comply with the law most of the time, what we tend to get the most frustrated by is when we feel like the law is not being applied to us fairly or evenly, that other people are receiving special treatment, that other people are not being subject to the same consequences, basically that something is being done to us that's not being done to somebody else, or not being done for us that's being done for someone else. More than anything, that notion of a lack of fairness pervades our society. And it's kind of interesting because in many ways that sense of fairness can be attributed almost, not entirely, but to a significant extent, to the 14th Amendment of the Constitution. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the 14th Amendment of the Constitution, but it has two. Good morning, Betty. We were worried that we weren't going to see you, so.
Sorry, we're late.
Oh, it's okay. So.
Why are we crowded today?
I know, right? You're supposed to sit over there, as far as I can tell.
Oh.
Seems to be a rule. So,
Wherever you want to sit.
I'm just messing with you. You can sit wherever you want to, but.
You're so kind.
How about that?
Thank you. So the 14th Amendment has two particular, there's a number of clauses, but the two really important ones that show up a lot in constitutional law are what are called equal protection and, I'm forgetting what the other one's called, due process. So under the theory of equal protection, all Americans, no matter what at the time the 14th Amendment was passed, it was a race thing was the main issue. No matter what their race is, no matter what their gender is, no matter what their, anything, they're supposed to be treated equally under the law. And by the same token, all Americans are entitled to due process of the law, which means that the law has to follow certain processes before it does something bad to you, takes something away from you, anything like that. And that principle, these principles of equal protection and due process are now built into our framework of government, to the point where if you were to go and look at almost any lawsuit that's filed today that is based on a constitutional argument, it includes a claim under the 14th Amendment for either a violation of equal protection or due process. Even some of the ones like we've seen where a police officer might get sued for using excessive force against someone. There's almost always a claim that is made through the 14th Amendment for that kind of a situation. And so this notion of fairness is something that we as Americans have very much ingrained in the way we think. But historically that's not really been particularly normal. Just as having a government that is responsive to our will through the democratic process was not something that was particularly normal. And so when we look at history, what we find is that most of the time, most people are kind of resigned to the idea that their government was capricious and wasn't particularly fair and didn't do things in a particularly good way for them, and that they could not rely on their government to do the same thing every time or to treat them the same as other people were treated. And so when Paul puts this in here in Colossians and tells parents, when you're using your authority, don't do it in a way that frustrates people, don't do it in a way that abuses your authority, he's really kind of putting down an idea that is a relatively unusual idea. The idea that people in positions of authority should do the right thing with that power. Now, why does it make sense that Paul would be saying that? Why does it seem appropriate?
Because the Sadducees, the Pharisees, and all the Sees, they did misuse the power miserably.
Okay.
Paul
They
himself?
really had the people in the dominant make their own rules, not God's rules.
Okay. So he has seen and he's to some extent been a part of the abuse of authority by people in position of power. So what, I didn't catch what you said.
To emphasize her point, that Paul himself
Yes.
misused the power.
That's,
yeah.
Persecuted the church, yeah, definitely. But let's flip it around. So where does Paul find an example of the proper use of authority then?
The woman.
Well, I mean, they had some, certainly they were further ahead than almost any other political society had ever been in terms of trying to be fair. Now, they had different classes. You had citizens and non-citizens to start with, and that definitely affected how you know, what kind of justice you got and how you got treated. But I'm thinking of something a little bit more expansive than that.
But in Paul tells he came to it, there were already Jewish believers, and now, of course, mostly treated one another fairly. They did not, you know, like other groups did.
Okay, so he's seeing the average Jew perhaps treat their fellow Jews in a fair manner. But again, where is he getting this idea of authority being used properly from?
Well, I don't know if it would be proper or not, but throughout the entire Gospels, he talks about the two-sidedness of the Pharisee, how that they are not fair in their application of law, of their own law. They're not equal. So I don't know if that's the point that you're making, but that's at least that side of it anyway.
Right.
I'm sure he saw that.
I think we can find plenty of examples that Paul would have experienced and others would have as well of authority being used in an unfair way. The whole situation with Jesus's trial and crucifixion was a blatant example of authority being misused, authority being applied apathetically in the case of Pilate, where he really didn't care. He just didn't want to have more problems, and so it wasn't that he was being unfair, he just didn't care. The Sanhedrin, on the other hand, and Herod were deliberately being unfair. So there's plenty of examples that Paul would have experienced, that the Christians would have experienced, of unfair and poorly applied authority. But I think what we're losing sight of here is we're looking at worldly examples, and you're losing sight of the bigger picture, which is that Paul is an apostle of Jesus Christ. And so when it comes to understanding what a properly applied authority looks like, he looks at God and he looks at Jesus, and he says, how do they treat people? How do they use their authority? And what you see with God is that you see him consistently applying his rules and his principles throughout time. And you see Jesus doing the same thing. And in Paul's experience with Jesus as the head of the church, he has a sense of the use of authority that Jesus has used and how he does it. And so when we think about authority figures, and we made this point a little bit before, it's important for authority figures, particularly the ones that children encounter early on, to view them as a positive. Now, not that they're going to like everything that they do, but to view them as a positive. That helps to create a mindset that is much more willing to accept and recognize legitimate authority going forward. And so I think it's much harder for kids who are raised with parents who are very abusive, who are very capricious, to really be able to come to embrace the authority of God, because there's any number of places in the scriptures that it talks about what we see. If we can't deal with that well, how are we going to deal with the things we can't see well? So when we see our parents and they're doing things that are that they have this power and they're using it in ways that is unfair or that is harmful, then it becomes natural to assume that power is used that way by everybody, including God, including Jesus, including people who are given authority by God. And sometimes that's true when it comes to people given authority by God, but nevertheless, it is an ideal situation, at least, to have parents who will raise their children in a way that will give them a sense of what authority is used for that is a positive thing. So children are supposed to obey their parents, and it doesn't matter whether or not the second part of that is followed. They're still supposed to obey and honor their parents, but in a Christian environment, parents should be operating with authority the same way that Jesus operates with authority, the same way that God operates with authority, which is in a way that is using the authority appropriately. So that's what I think Paul is talking about here. Now, talking then about a relationship that's not as fair, kind of inherently, is when we talk about masters and slaves. I talked last week a little bit about slavery and the period of time that we're looking at and how different that was from what we would think of in terms of American slavery. But regardless of how you look at it, it would be easy if you were in a position of slavery to feel like you had been treated unfairly just by the nature of being in that position. Because most likely you came into that either through some debt that you incurred, and perhaps, yes, you were responsible for that debt, but boy, you weren't expecting to end up in slavery, or you came to that through some sort of conquest of your people or the organization you were associated with, in which case, again, you might feel like this is an unfair kind of an outcome. And yet, Paul says to slaves, obey those who are your masters on earth. And as in the parallel passage we looked at last week as well, he says, not just doing the bare minimum, not just doing it externally so you don't get punished for it, but doing it to please God. So doing it with your heart, because God looks at your heart and at your motivations. Now elsewhere, we know, if we look at the book of Philemon in particular, that Paul also tells masters to treat their slaves in a proper way, to be fair, to be just, and to be mindful of them in that respect. But in this context, he doesn't make it a reciprocal thing. If they do that, then you have to do this. It's your job is this. And I'm going to tell each person what their job is, but just because they aren't doing their job doesn't mean you don't get to do your job. Which, again, to us as Americans seems unfair, because we're not used to that kind of a system. But where does that idea come from, of you do your job and don't worry about what the other guy does? In the Christian environment, where does that principle come from?
Well, it's a personal obedience to God's command. I mean, basically, again, the authority of God and the authority of Christ, if that's the point you're looking at.
Well, that's an aspect of it. So our behavior is not dependent on what other people do. Our behavior is dependent on our relationship with God.
Yes.
And so ultimately, we're not looking to please men, we're looking to please God. And when we see that carried out in terms of how we treat people, we see it embodied in the golden rule. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Not do unto others as they've been doing unto you, or as you can reasonably expect them to do unto you, or anything else like that. There's no fairness built into the golden rule. If you actually think about it, the golden rule is one of the most unfair principles you can imagine, because it's basically saying you do the right thing, and regardless of whether the other person does the right thing back. And there's a good bet that the other person isn't going to do the right thing back. But the principle is our relationship with God is what we're honoring, not the things that other people have been doing to us. So we have these principles of authority, and the idea that where there is authority, that you respond to authority. If you're the person under authority, you respond to that authority as though that authority were coming from God, because, as we'll see in a minute here, in one respect at least, it is. So, continuing on, actually moving over to Hebrews chapter 13, the Hebrew writer says, "Obey your leaders and submit to them, for they keep watch over your souls as those who will give an account. Let them do this with joy and not with grief, for this would be unprofitable for you." Okay? So once again, we see this principle of authority. And in this case, it's governmental authority. So now we're outside of the scope of the church or of smaller individual relationships. We're talking about how we as individuals deal with authority that's placed over us in the form of government. And he says that they keep watch. Well, in this particular context, I'm sorry, I'm misremembering, or I'm getting ahead of myself. This particular context, the leaders he's talking about are much more like the church leaders, actually. I apologize, I'm getting ahead of myself, as I said. We'll in a minute we'll get to that.
That was
Yeah,
the buzzer.
I know there's a couple of kind of puzzled looks out there, and I'm thinking, this isn't really a very challenging passage. And then I'm realizing, wait a minute, somebody's challenged, and it's not the group, it's me. So yeah, the second part of that first sentence is the big clue, because he says they keep a watch over your souls. There's no place where it talks about obeying human authority where it mentions them keeping watch over your souls. Now, it talks about the authority having the sword for punishment, but not from a standpoint of a moral thing. So this is clearly talking about church leadership and the importance and the necessity as Christians of being obedient to those who lead us, because their job is to help to protect our souls. And so if we won't listen to them, it's real hard for them to do that job well. And we can definitely see examples of this. The flip side to this is that we can definitely see examples of church leadership being abusive in what they do. And we can see that from the standpoint, I suspect that every one of you has experiences with a church or with a leadership at a church or a particular leader at a church where they were abusing their authority, overreaching, in some cases underdoing it, or reacting with favoritism. I mean, there's examples of all sorts of stuff. And when you look through history at the church organizations and the various incarnations or versions of churches that we see, you see a lot of that going on. And in particular, the more consolidated, the greater the power that is accumulated by a particular church office or church leader, the more the tendency is for something really wrong to be done with it. And so some of the worst abuses in history have been undertaken by popes who had essentially close to unlimited authority. The rulers of the world, the kings and emperors, all answered to those popes, because essentially without the approval of those popes, the leaders would lose their positions. And so the popes in fact controlled armies and treasuries that were bigger than anything else in all of Europe, in all of the world in most cases, and they could do almost anything they wanted to. And so there's a number of popes that did some very abusive things, and there's a group of popes that were so bad that the Catholic Church considers them to be, what is the term, anapopes, I think? Basically, they are anti-popes, the more modern term. They are officially on the record as having been a pope, but from the Catholic Church's perspective, they were in fact not actually popes. They were just wolves in sheep's clothing kind of a thing, because of how bad the things that they did were. So power of leading can become very dangerous if too much is taken and too much is used and is done in ways that are inappropriate. But in spite of that, we're still commanded to obey our leaders and submit to them. And he says, let them do this with joy and not with grief, for this would be unprofitable for you. So in his case, the Hebrew writer is talking specifically about leaders who are trying to do the right thing and the importance of making their job as easy as possible. Because I don't know how many of you have served as elders or church leaders, but having followed my father's career as first as a deacon and then as an elder in the church, I can tell you it is a very time-consuming and frustrating and spiritually and mentally exhausting work. It's got a lot of joy to it, but it can really wear you down even when people are cooperating, because you're dealing with a lot of difficult stuff. And so we want to make it as easy as possible for our leaders to lead us particularly when they're trying to do their best. Now, there's some things we do if they're not doing their best, but that's a different issue at this point. So, another aspect of this authority that we see is young to old. Now, in our society today, we talked about this last week, but the relationship between young and old has become completely reversed in our society, and I think to our detriment, overwhelmingly to our detriment. I'm not sure that I would like to have gone back to the situation where kids are basically property and disposable assets, but there's got to be some sort of middle ground that doesn't involve where we're at this point, where kids basically run the show. But Peter says to younger men, he says, likewise be subject to your elders. And all of you clothe yourself with humility towards one another, for God is opposed to the proud, but gives grace to the humble. So he's going through and talking about some of the relationships between people. Most of the ones he's mentioned are parallels to what we already talked about, so we're not going to repeat them. But one of the ones he mentions is younger men and older men. Now, why might younger men start to feel like they don't need to be subject to the elders, the men that are older than them?
I think all young men go through that. And it's because as they emerge into adulthood, they're very energetic, empowered, and their worldview in their mind is complete. They know everything already. And so that's a dangerous attitude to have toward an older man like your father or grandfather or any older man that moves slower, thinks longer, speaks less. The younger men are like, you're senile,
Yeah.
in essence. They don't have any wisdom at all.
Okay.
So it's not the case. Now in Japan, that's not so much the case.
Yeah. When you look at Asian society in general, if you look at China, you look at Japan, historically there has been a much higher regard for older people, for elders. Now, as we talked very briefly about this at the end of class last week, as Western and American idealism and concepts have been exported throughout most of the world, some of that has broken down, even in places like Japan and China, where there's far less likelihood to have that, as well as, in both of those cases, as the economic systems have been challenged. And it's harder for younger people to look and see what the elders have done for them in terms of setting things up, that it's become easier for them to be more judgmental and less accepting. But historically, you're right, there was much more of that in different cultures. And by the same token, in cultures that tended to be in the Middle East, elders were generally viewed as being, having a superior knowledge and being somebody who should be honored. Whether it's the Jewish culture, whether it is Arabic culture, Muslim culture, most of them do have a significant element of that. And here again, as they encounter Western cultures, that begins to break down some, because the Western cultures are very, very different from that. And at least today, because of this idea that youth is the most important ideal, that energy, that vitality. And of course, the biggest problem with youth is the lack of experience. The part of the reason why older people speak slower is because you've learned to stop and think about what you're going to say. Where, the younger you are, the less time you usually spend thinking, the more time you spend making sure you get your point across, And so I spent a lot of my time when I was younger thinking exactly that about my dad, that he just wasn't particularly, not that he wasn't smart, because I knew he was smart. He had to be smart to do what he did as a job and stuff. And talking to him, you could tell he was smart. But that he wasn't particularly quick on his feet, that he just took a long time to answer, to say things. Sometimes he didn't respond to things that I thought, obviously you should respond to that sort of a thing. And as I've gotten older, I've come to recognize that there is a lot of wisdom in taking your time when you speak, and in sometimes not speaking, even when there is definitely an answer you could give. There are definitely still times when you're better off letting it go than having to say something every time. And that's something I still struggle with, because my background, my nature from when I was a kid, and certainly my training as an attorney and now as a minister, these are not things that teach you to keep your mouth shut. They teach you the opposite, to answer and always want to say something. And there are times when that's not really very helpful. So wisdom sometimes involves learning that, often involves learning that, And for younger men and younger people in general, it is more of a challenge to embrace that idea of recognizing the wisdom of those who choose to be deliberate in how they do things, who choose to be cautious in what they do. And so what we have is this lack of humility. And really, if we look at all of these different situations, all these different authority situations, humility is a necessity for sure if you're one of the ones who is under authority. Because if you don't have humility, you're going to have a really hard time, even with proper authority, much less somebody who's being capricious or whatever. But also, if you don't have humility, it can be very difficult to be an effective leader as well. Because humility is something where, humility isn't simply, we're going to do whatever you want. That's not what humility is. Humility is recognizing that other people are important to you, that other people, as Paul says, are better than you, more valuable than you. And a good leader understands that the people they lead are at least as important as they are, if not more so. And if they view it that way, they're much less likely to abuse their authority. They're much more likely to be able to have successful leadership. And the people under them, if they're being humble, are much more likely to follow and listen rather than trying to take over and lead. So humility becomes one of those key characteristics for successful operating systems of authority. And we see, and here again, I think probably one of the reasons young men and young people in general have trouble with authorities because they don't always have a lot of humility. So we see these things, and when you listen to some of the people talking about their rights and the way that they view the government or the way that they view their parents or whatever, you can see a deep lack of humility in many of them. A massive degree of assumption that they know everything and that everyone else is just wrong. And so we see some of that being carried out. So then let's take it, oh sorry Jerry, go ahead.
As probably a change of subject, but how in the world do you teach humility?
I think you have to model it more than anything else. The most effective way to teach anything is to model it. So I think there's a big element of that. The other historical approach has been to knock some humble into you. So, you're going to be humble, or I'm going to beat you down a few more times, and then eventually you're going to get humble. Unfortunately, that one often backfires because the more you use force or coercion to try to teach a sort of a fruit of the spirit kind of a thing, the more likely you are to produce the opposite effect, to produce rebellion and dislike and those kinds of things. So it's tricky. Steve?
To me, humility is not something that you go and get. It's the result of something else. So the result of getting rid of arrogance in your life will result in the fruit of humility.
Yeah.
That's true. Doesn't it have a great deal of recognition of authority? I mean, humility, recognizing that you're not number one.
I think true humility always begins with a recognition of God's authority.
Yeah.
Because the one place where you can always look, if you do have a knowledge of God, is you can look at God and you can see two things. Number one, you can see the right of authority through power. God has the power to have the authority that he has. But secondly, you can see the right of authority through the proper use of that authority. God is unlike humans, or for that matter, the gods that humans have made up, in terms of how he uses his power. He does it for the benefit of mankind. He does it in a consistent way. He is a good God.
The greatest example of that that I have thought about is the trial before Pilate with Christ. I mean, Christ had the power, but he didn't use it.
Right. And in his case, it wasn't even just about honoring Pilate. It was about the necessity of what he was going through in a much bigger picture as well.
He had the power to stomp Pilate, and there's no question about it.
Yeah.
He could have if he'd had that desire.
Yes. And then and you can see that all throughout Jesus' life on so many occasions. The temptations by Satan, where Satan blatantly or explicitly says to him, you have this power, and Jesus says, I'm not using that power. I'm interested in honoring God's will. And then in the garden, it's the same basic conversation. Not my will, but yours. So it's not what I can do, it's what I'm choosing to do because of what you want. And so there's that relationship. Ian?
I think to Jerry's question about what's the best way to teach or how do you teach humility, vast majority of my humility I taught myself. You learn by failures, right? Failure is a really good way to humble or to be humbled. So I watch the kids that I train at work, right? They've never been on a machine in their life, and after a couple of months of running a machine, they've got it all figured out and come to me when they blow something up because of their better way. Well, they're a lot more humble than when they went into that job.
Because they've now experienced what happens when they think they know all the right answers.
So
yeah.
Every time that I can recall where I've been maybe a little overly prideful, well, I get humbled real quick by some way or other. So I think a lot of humility is learned from failures.
There's a proverb that talks about that. I think vaguely, I remember something about that, you know, that God gives grace to the humble, but he lays low the proud.
Yes.
Basically, that's the way that the world works. And you see this, you can see this on you know, the public scale as well. You know, the athlete who is celebrating his success and then immediately has something bad happen to them, you know. It doesn't always happen. Sometimes you know, you don't see that humbling effect. And we want the fairness of that, but that's not the point. The point is the necessity or the importance of learning humility, and a lot of times that comes through things going wrong when you think you've got everything right. I can still remember, when I was younger, I was a decent water skier, not a trick or anything like that, but I could ski quite well on a single ski, and I could, because of how much weight I had especially, I could create huge rooster tails when I was skiing along behind our boat. And there were times where I would be going very, very fast, and it was a lot of fun, and you could really show off with that, and so you do different things like that. But I can still remember one particular occasion. There was we would go to the lake with several friends who had boats as well, and their boat was in the water, and one of their kids, a little bit older than me, she was getting her skis on and getting ready to start skiing, and we drove past them with our boat, and I went way outside of the wake to kind of show off, to kick out this big rooster tail and kind of show off, not really thinking about the fact that that creates problems for somebody who's trying to put a ski on as well, without having the waves and everything else happen. But I was way out there showing off, and without really paying attention to it, I cut back into the wake real quickly. And the problem with cutting back really quickly is that the tension of the rope goes away, and I literally saw the rope just drop into the water because of how quickly I'd come back. And when that happens, there's nothing pulling you anymore, and the constant tension is what makes it possible for you to stay up when you're skiing. Once you lose that tension, you begin to sink. And so I started to sink, and I'm thinking maybe I can hold on to this. You know, I'm going to hold on to this rope as tight as I can, and maybe I can. But when you start skiing at the beginning of a run, it gradually accelerates. You don't have it all at once. A 30-mile-an-hour force that goes from 0 to 30 over time is one thing. 0 to 30 in an instant is not. And so I nearly had my arms pulled out of their sockets. I ended up going head over heels on the water, and you know, that little fancy thing that I was trying to show off with turned into this big embarrassment to me, because here I am, you know, discombobulated in the water. And so, you know, that desire to show off, that desire to say how good we are, oftentimes comes back to haunt us when reality kicks in. So we have to be cautious about that. Okay, so the last element of this then is the government institutions, the thing that I thought we were looking at earlier. So Peter says something, and we're going to look at the Romans passage as well, but Peter says that we should submit ourselves for the Lord's sake. There again, almost every time that one of these authors has talked about why we're submitting ourselves, it calls to the Lord. It doesn't say because they're so great. It doesn't say because they're doing everything right. It says for the Lord's sake, you're going to submit yourself to every human institution, whether to a king as the one in authority, or to governors as sent by him for the punishment of evildoers and the praise of those who do right. For such is the will of God, that by doing right you may silence the ignorance of foolish men. Act as free men, and do not use your freedom as a covering for evil, but use it as bondslaves of God. Honor all people, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the king. Now here again, there is in this the implication that authority, governmental authority, exists for the purpose of punishing evildoers and praising those who do right. But he doesn't actually say honor them if they're doing that. He simply says honor authority because of your relationship with God. And so we have this idea that, that when we honor human authority, that we are doing it, or we're doing something that honors God. And he even says that if you do that, if you honor human authority, you silence the ignorance of foolish men. And there were many people, by the time Peter writes this letter, that were speaking about Christians as being those who would not follow the law. Because they did say we follow God's law first, there was those who would say that means that they don't actually follow man's law. That means that they don't actually obey. And in fact, that was not the case for Christians in general. And so Peter is wanting to emphasize the importance of maintaining that position, that idea that we're going to honor God by honoring authority. And then if you do that, he says, that is going to create and make people, it's going to force people to recognize that you're doing the right thing. That's a lie when it says that Christians are disobedient and that they don't believe in the emperor or whatever else it is. Yes, God comes first, but for the most part, there's not a lot of distinction between, or there's not a lot of places at this time at least, where the emperor is asking for things that are contrary to what God wants. Now, as time progresses, that's going to change. Under certain emperors, particularly Diocletian, but there are a number of other ones, the cult of emperor worship and the demand that everyone do that kind of a thing became a problem for the Christians, as it did for the Jews as well, and ultimately created a lot of the impetus for the persecutions that took place. But most of the time, throughout most of history, well, that's not really fair to say, much of the time throughout history, Christians have been able to mostly, at least, follow the laws without violating their conscience, and to the extent that they were breaking the laws, it was either by not pledging an allegiance or worship to a human-created authority, or by doing something like gathering together to worship in secret that did violate the law, but that was a small part of their overall lives. So an important thing to recognize is that to the extent that we have a license to violate the law where it goes contrary to God's will, that license goes only how far? What's the limit to the license that we have in that regard?
It's as long that we are pressured in or asked in something that God says it's an abomination to him. It is not his will, and we know. We cannot go against God. But if it is something, you know, that, okay, you can do this, but then you have, it's a kind of a fine line. Because you really have to go with the word and say, what does God say? If somebody says, well, we can't do abortion, no, you cannot. And life begins by conception. And if we go against that, we go against God to agree with this law. That is for us to say, no, I cannot say yes or go with this law because it's against God.
Okay, so one of the things that we need to recognize is that our license, as it were, to go against a law is completely a function of that law being contrary to God's law. So you can't say, okay, well, our government is allowing abortions, so I don't have to do anything, I don't have to pay my taxes, I don't have to do anything the government wants me to do. You have people who use that argument, people who are, whether it's from a political standpoint or from a religious standpoint, where they are trying to basically find a way around following the government's expectations or the rules. They will basically highlight one particular thing or a group of things that the government is doing that they believe are moral wrongs, and they will say that that then justifies me not following any of the laws. And that's simply not the case. You don't see Christians in the first century disobeying every aspect of Roman or Jewish or local law just because there were things that were being done that were wrong. The license extends only to those things that are in fact something that is contrary to God's law. Now the other aspect of this, and this is the one where it starts to get a little bit trickier, and I think the line becomes a little finer, is how do we deal with a situation in which what is wrong is not something that I am being forced to do, but rather something that is being permitted or is being encouraged or whatever under the law. Does that give me, so to use the abortion example in particular, so the law says in most places, of course it's more complicated now, but the law says that in most places abortion is legal to a fairly significant extent. There's restrictions in almost every place, but the restrictions are kind of a ways out there. So when it comes to the question of whether a Christian should have an abortion or encourage others to get an abortion, I think the answer to that is obviously no. You don't do that, you don't encourage somebody else to do that. But the question becomes more complicated. What is our job when it comes to that law beyond not doing it ourselves? Do we have an obligation to try to stop other people from getting abortions, not by argument or by presenting concepts, but by actively resisting in some way? Jerry?
I think you answered it right there yourself, that we can't violate civil law to accomplish that end. In other words, you can't go into insurrection just because you object to X happening. The other part would be, we have opportunity in this country, now maybe some governments do not, but that we can formally object to something on a large scale basis, or at least be a part of that objection. And that's within God's law as well as within civil law.
Right.
So I think there's where we have is I'm not going to participate in abortion, but I might become a part of a group that opposes abortion. And I can do that under God's law as well as under civil law.
Yes. And I think that's, and when you look at what happened with the reversal of the Roe v. Wade decision a year or so, a year and a half, 2 years ago now, that was the product of Christians voting over the period of decades, literally, to first get the right presidents and the right Congresses into place to gradually change the makeup of the court. So this was actually like a three-level process, getting enough Christians to vote, getting the right presidents and a line of those presidents, and having the opportunity to appoint enough justices to where then at the Supreme Court level, where the Roe v. Wade decision had been made, the court was then in a position to reverse that decision and to allow the states to make their own decisions about what to do with regard to the laws on abortion. So this was Christians using their democratic rights to change the law. And as Christians, there's absolutely no question, when we are given the privilege and the opportunity, or the right in this country, to vote, to have an influence on the direction our government takes, we absolutely should be doing that. There's absolutely nothing wrong with us doing that, any more than there's anything wrong with Christians participating in politics. So these are things, these are places we want Christians to be. We want Christians to be county attorneys. We want them to be working in governmental positions where they can influence the direction of policy. And we want, as voters, to use that voting power to also impact what we want. But there's a huge difference between that kind of thinking, or the kinds of things that you have pregnancy crisis centers or different ones like that will work with women and try to show them alternatives to abortion, give them assistance in ways that they can choose something else. These are all legitimate ways to change people's minds, to change people's behavior. But the person who thinks that the solution that God wants them to use is to kill an abortion doctor, or burn down an abortion clinic, or something like that, where you are now violating the law to try to stop it. I understand the mindset, the thinking that says, I'm just so desperate to come up with some kind of solution, but that's not God's way. There's a difference between choosing not to participate in something godless and choosing to do something that is wrong in order to try to stop that. Ultimately, our job is to keep ourselves pure and to teach other people what it means to be pure, but it is not to force other people to be pure. That's probably in some ways one of the biggest differences between the old law and the new law. Under the old law, because it was in fact the governmental system, it was the job of the old law to punish people when they broke the laws and the rules, when they sinned. Now, that is not the system, and so we have to be recognizing that in fact our job is to teach, not to force. And so that kind of changes the perspective. All right, we are actually over time, so we're going to keep the last part of this until next week. No, sorry, the week after next, because I will not be teaching next week. Until the week after next, and then we'll finish this up and move on to the next commandment at that point. So thank you guys for your participation.